I think I'm here today to offer kind of a contrarian view. I believe the reason I was asked to participate is because of an essay I did for Foreign Policy last fall, in which I argued that at least some of Qatar's poor image in the international press is its own fault. Specifically because Qatar's media laws make it virtually impossible for local media to report in depth on topics like migrant labor. The country abandons the field to others to tell its story to the world. I would go further and argue that if you want to read a caricatured narrative about the complex place that is Qatar, you simply have to read the local media. With important exceptions, the newspapers here are an obsequious parade of press releases and grip and grin photos. You can read almost verbatim the same story in every newspaper. There are many excellent journalists from all over the world working here, and all of them will tell you there are lines there that they cannot cross. I want to give a nod also to the paper I like here, the Doha News, which was banned in 2016 for not having a license, and then was revived about 3 years ago, and they push the limits all the time. They have done some excellent reporting, and I know they have reporters here today, and a good number of their staff are former Northwestern students. Now, to be clear, the media nonsense directed at Qatar since 2010 has ranged from uninformed to simply racist. It was mostly negative and one-dimensional, most of it from people who had never actually been here. You'll recall The Guardian was first out of the gate in 2010 when almost the same time Qatar won its bid. The paper published an op-ed by a Human Rights Watch official titled, "Let Qatar 22 Not Be Built on Brutality." And then that was famously bookended by the 2021 article the paper published that claims 6,500 workers have been killed in World Cup projects. That story's been debunked actually by any number of journalists, including me, but of course the number lives on. I heard CNN refer to it in an unrelated story about a month ago. During the tournament itself, there were stories about the camel flu and the Qatari team as terrorists. There were allegations made by his brother that Grant Wall was assassinated. And in the academic literature, there were comparisons of Qatar 22 to Berlin 36 and Argentina 78. Against all that nonsense, some of the postmortems I've attended here in Doha after the World Cup have also been not very good. At an academic discussion that Northwestern hosted last February, one of the panelists waved away all critical coverage of Qatar as pack journalism. This is the kind of sophisticated media analysis I would expect from Trump, Orban, or Erdogan, not a journalism professor. In fact, there was some fair coverage of Qatar all around the world. Several members of the panel asked rhetorically whether France or the US or Canada or Mexico will get similar journalistic treatment in 2024 or 26, and it didn't seem to occur to them that the answer to that question is yes. Not only will journalists in those countries actually be free to do that reporting, they should. If the human rights credentials of the host are at issue, half the United States is eager to elect as president a man who is campaigning on a pledge to be a dictator. Mexico leads the world in the number of journalists murdered each year. In Canada, the House of Commons has spent the last year investigating sexual abuse of minors in sports from gymnastics to ice hockey. And last week, as Danyel mentioned, of course, the French sports minister announced that French athletes will not be able to wear the hijab in the Paris Olympics, despite the fact that no Olympic federation has such a ban and hasn't had one since 2018 or 2019. And then just recently, last month, after the World Athletics Championships in Budapest, Sebastian Coe endorsed Hungary as an Olympic venue, and you can't find a bigger democratic backslider in Europe than Hungary. There, as in many Western states, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-black racism are now central to domestic politics. None of this changes the fact that the intense focus on sports mega events and human rights long predates Qatar's 2010 bid. It actually began in 1983 when Beijing bid for the 2000 Olympics. And long before that, conflicts over the moral high ground in international sports have led not just to boycotts, but to alternative competitions. It was 60 years ago that Indonesian President Sukarno declared the Olympics a tool for imperialists and organized the Games of the New Emerging Forces, which was a competition of newly decolonized states in China. Immediately before this summer's Paris Olympics, there will be the 6th annual BRICS Games in Kazan, Russia. Since at least 1960, every Olympics has been subject to boycott threat, including from global South countries, and always because of human rights. There is a very real possibility that next summer in Paris, we will see Russian and Belarusian athletes competing, but no Ukrainians. One of the biggest human rights issues in sports now concerns whether trans women can compete as women in sports from chess to rugby, and frankly, an attempt to engage in critical conversation on that topic is to guarantee that someone will brand you as transphobic. One reason for this human rights focus is because sports mega events, wherever they are held, involve human rights issues and violations. In 1996, for example, Atlanta police arrested 9,000 homeless people in the days before the beginning of those games just to clean up the city's appearance. In 2010, Vancouver essentially criminalized criticism of its winter games. For its 2010 World Cup, South Africa displaced about 15,000 Cape Town residents to make way for construction projects. As a result of all this, both FIFA and IOC have increasingly been forced to add more human rights language to their charters, the IOC as recently as just last month. The IOC, of course, has held itself out as a human rights organization from the beginning. The language that Coubertin employed in 1896 about international sport, fostering peace and development, is the same language Qatari officials use to describe their World Cup. It's the same language the British used as they exported their sports along with their empire. It's the same language that everyone uses. You might believe in this stuff, I'm pretty sure I believe in this stuff, but there's no empirical evidence for any of it. You can't find a single scholarly article anywhere that tests that peace and development claim. That disconnect invites scrutiny, whether a host country is Saudi Arabia or China, the United States or Israel, India or Hungary. The human rights focus and the othering that comes with it is only going to increase in the Gulf states, which right now are among the very few countries that both want these international competitions and can afford to pay for them. Saudi Arabia especially can expect scrutiny for its human rights record. Qatar, it seems to me, has the advantage in this competition because unlike its neighbors, it's a good actor on the international stage. Saudi Arabia is not going to invite Human Rights Watch and ILO in to do reports. So the none of this is, my view is that Qatar could help itself by liberalizing its 44-year-old media law, which is a legacy of the British protectorate period. Now, the official view here is that Qatar, quote, ended censorship of the local press, unquote, in 1995, and then completely with the abolition of the old Ministry of Information in 1998. The reality is something else. The 1979 Princeton Publications Law includes potentially limitless prohibitions on speech the government disfavors, licensing requirements for publications, and criminal provisions for virtually every offense, including libel. The 2014 cybercrime law includes additional fines and prison time for the same offenses, and a false news law was added to the penal code in 2020, 2 years after Qatar ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Shura Council has 3 times in the last 12 years proposed a new media law, the last time in 2019, but none has been given effect. The Council has twice in the last year, including just last month, proposed a right to information law, but so far that has not materialized. With respect to news coverage of the World Cup, as we all know, one of the ways Qatar responded to international criticism was to point to the significant legal reforms it made between 2017 and 2020, and even well before that. In my experience last year, that story either didn't land or was simply ignored, and outrage was exaggerated. I don't think it helped that the information that came out of Qatar was mostly descriptive, a lot of press releases with no real reporting about implementation. Whenever we talk about journalism, I always want to clarify that reporting is a special thing within journalism. I always resent the term content, which was invented by the business people who took over my industry 30 years ago. Content tells you that your hard work is garbage and that garbage is good stuff. But there has been no real reporting about implementation here. Ordinarily, a news organization covering the story would seek to examine records held by the responsible ministry, but there is no public records requirement in Qatar and no Gulf state except for Yemen. If you go to the Labor Ministry website today, except for some short event announcements, there is no implementation report more current than 2022. The statistics page has no statistics. The ministry's WhatsApp number, where workers are supposed to be able to get information, has never responded to any of my questions, not even to hello. I'm not suggesting that Qatar adopt an American-style free press, or an English or a German or a Canadian one. Those systems are all very different. There is no one right way to do it. American media law has some serious problems in my view, and even the English are embarrassed by their media law. But Qatar isn't even in the game. despite itself setting expectations high. During the blockade, the Emir appeared on 60 Minutes in the US and talked about the country's commitment to free speech. About the same time, the foreign minister gave a speech at Chatham House saying much the same thing. The country is home to Al Jazeera, a world-class news organization. It's home to Northwestern, a world-class journalism school. What is all this for? So I'll conclude where I began. If you don't empower your media to tell your own story, you will empower others to do it for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Shireen.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So the question that I was asked is, to what extent can the criticism of Qatar in Western media be considered Islamophobia? And my reply in response to this is, my response is not only a critique of media itself, but bad actors in the industry, but also the processes that continue to be used and to be taught widely. I'm a full-time practicing journalist with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the sport specifically, but I'm also someone who believes profoundly in public scholarship. As an instructor, the number of racialized students in my program has grown considerably, but it is still very reminiscent of the industry where almost 90% where I work are white, able-bodied, cishet men. And if you look at this panel, it's also representative of the actual industry that I work in. And I just wanted to say as well, in the previous panel, Dr. Masri talked about a mention of a lack of expertise in sports media. And I mean, it's worse in sports media as opposed to general media, where if you eat a shawarma, you're allowed to comment on the entire region. And the issue of Islamophobia is actually quite rife in pervasive in football and football culture. There's anti-blackness, there's also a tremendous amount of gendered Islamophobia, which I will touch on, but the reluctance of that media to actually dive deeply into issues around football and Muslim women, which I will address. I do also want to change a quick narrative historically. The first World Cup to be hosted in the Middle East was not in Qatar. It was actually in Jordan, in Amman, for the U17 women's in 2016, that I went to Twitter, now in comatose mode, and really tried to correct everybody repeating this stat over and over again. So it's actually a lack of knowledge and history of the game itself. There are certainly ways that criticism of Qatar is marinated in anti-Muslim sentiment. And if we start at the bid level, there was not only concerns about the heat in Qatar, but there's little of those same critiques when in 2026, Texas will be hosting one of the in the summer, where the temperatures swelter above 45 degrees Celsius. And then there's the misogynistic criticism of Zaha Hadid's architecture of stadiums that were constantly called vagina stadiums, and as opposed to being dubbed futuristic and modern and in spirit of what was being hosted. There was fair criticisms and amplifications and concerns from LGBTIQS+ communities, which are very valid. However, the same levels of dismissals were not applied to Russia ahead of 2018, not at all on the same level. And I've been working in this industry since 2012, and there was nothing that remotely resembled the issues faced by Qatari culture, faith groups, populations, and traditions. And as Professor LaMay just pointed out, because of a media ban, it was left for other people to tell those stories with little to no corrections from the Western world. So the double standard is appalling, but it's also glaringly obvious here. I constantly saw reports and accusations of lack of rights with women in Qatar, but so few reporters were actually speaking to Qatari women or women who actually live in Qatar. And I was here in November 2022 for the Men's World Cup, and I got a chance to speak with women here, but also women that I was connected to from the Qatar Foundation. And I was told that the majority of students in post-secondary institutions at University City are women. And it's not like 50%, it's somewhere close to 70. So the leadership and the projection of leaders in this country will be women. And there's movements in sports by young women and leaders to not only encourage healthy lifestyles, but mobility, education, freedom of thought. And as one of the only Muslim women with a prominent platform in Western media, I've noted and recognized Islamophobic reports and tropes that are used mercilessly. So I will also juxtapose the barrage of anti-Muslim and racist coverage with media's lack in commitment to actually involve Muslim women at all. And there's a definite disinterest in the black and brown bodies of Muslim women. I was the first journalist to write and cover in any capacity about hijab bans of Muslim women in sport. And this was post the ban in 2014 when FIBA had they struck down the ban, which was started in 2007 from a very specific policy level. But it continues today, and I was one of the first people to write about the continuing of that hijab ban in France, and then spoke about and wrote about Les Hijabeuses, a group in France who are resisting, essentially, or my Persian sisters in Iran who do not have access to stadiums still in a free and access to freedom of attending even a sporting event. And despite my rants on Twitter, which is actually how Tony and I connected, Western media simply refuses to or are disinterested in anything about this. So I've researched, given interviews, and written extensively about Muslim sportswomen and self-identity in those digital spaces or in those sports spaces, but it continues to be largely ignored. Instead, we saw people using content and posting photos of Nuhaila Benzina, the first Muslim woman to wear hijab at a senior tournament, because remember, there was one in Amman in 2016. But nobody would juxtapose that with the obvious fact that Nuhaila Benzina, revered around the world and posted countless times on Twitter and Instagram, wouldn't be able to play professionally in France. But nobody actually wanted to dive into that. Sports is inherently in the blood and lived experiences of so many Muslim women in Muslim majority spaces, or girls of immigrant histories or displacement. And I keep thinking about what Dr. Deepa Kumar said yesterday about anti-Muslim racism and the cases I've worked on or researched. It's also coupled with misogyny and sexism, or misogynoir if they're specifically from African or Black communities. And I think semantics are critical to the discussion here about women and freedom and clothing and accommodations. And one of the ways that gendered Islamophobia manifests is through asserting the old trope that, they're discriminated against not only within the faith and the community, but also need to be liberated by external factors. And so that white saviorist trope also falls in. There's this idea that an absolute lack of choice in faith and social expressions exist in Muslim majority countries. Now, we have seen the Zan Zaman Azadi protests in Iran that came out, which is really important to understand, and I maintain that forcing women out of clothing is as violent as forcing them into it. There was no dissent allowed also because of Qatar and its concerns of bad press. So as opposed to diving forward and discussing, it was avoided completely. Not exactly a great strategy, in my opinion. And there's a constant directive from FIFA, which is something that's missing from this conversation. And their complicit nature, as some colleague of mine, Dr. Frank O'Reilly of Columbia University, literally calls it a mafia. And their attempt to prevent any bad press to fall upon them. We know how beautifully they handle Luis Rubiales in Spain, the issue that just happened. So if international governing bodies of Spain, of football, it's still in my brain, would stop prioritizing money instead of human rights, we may see a change. And if they were held to account, that would be preferable. And if they really cared, they would allow access to sports safely. And then women in France would be permitted to play. They would manage, coach, officiate, to be part of specialized support and teams, medical teams. But you can't, so it's almost like it doesn't happen. And misogyny doesn't exist in other places. When in the United States, women can't access safe reproductive health care. Mexico is rife with femicide. And in Canada, they're still sterilizing Indigenous women. So it's really nice to point the fingers over here and say, oh, well, they're so bad. And I certainly intend to cover these issues if I'm not fired. I think Muslim women do experience misogyny, and it's even more complicated because it is layered with xenophobia and racism. So anti-Muslimness is really prevalent, and it will remain as part of a normalized media process as long as there's a massive lack of Muslim decision makers, journalists, producers, editors, or content creators. I know you don't like that, but it's kind of weird. But one of the only ways to truly change how Islamophobia affects women in football is to report it and discuss it and constantly and diligently. Just also have people who understand the situation from various cultural, religious, and marginalized communities in those positions of power for policymaking and for implementation, and understanding that Muslims are not a monolith anywhere in the world, and particularly not in the football space. So that's the end of that particular rant.
Thank you, Shireen. And if I've already received a question for Craig, if you would like to ask a question to Shireen, please scan the code on your table and do so. Let's continue discussing the second World Cup in the Middle East with Tony.
And Shireen, actually, I must correct you. We brought you to talk to our class at the New School on the politics of global football on Zoom twice. But yeah, everything I know in this space, actually, I know from Shireen, so listen to her, not me. Actually, the most important thing she just said was about if I'm not fired, because actually, this is actually quite important, and also previous to the panel that came before us. Sure, the legal system in many Western countries allows journalists to report facts and so on, but which facts you get to report and which facts you're told are unimportant or matter less, which facts matter more, are questions of narrative, and narratives that are shaped by power. I worked for Time magazine for 15 years. I have bitter experience of the proximity of some very established and esteemed Western media outlets to power and to the narratives of power. So I know we've all done a version of this on this panel, if you're not doing one too, but when I started looking at the coverage of Qatar and thinking about what's going on here, trying a little thought experiment. It's 2026. Instead of covering the opening ceremony live, as the BBC always does, except when it was in Qatar, the BBC decides to do an hour of programming on the moral and physical hazards of hosting a World Cup, principally in the United States, with Canada and the NAFTA countries thrown in. But sorry, it is going to be principally in the United States. We know that's the center of gravity. So think about, what would you say about a society if you chose a different set of narratives? If you were going to do what was FIFA thinking in awarding the World Cup to a country where this year alone, by September 4th, 484 mass shootings. Almost twice a day, at least 4 people are killed in a shooting in the United States, and in a country that has 120 guns per 100 people. There are more guns than people. The authorities seem unable or unwilling to do anything about this epidemic of violence. The police kill 1,000 people a year, kill black people at twice the rate at which they kill white people. There are 2 million people in prison in the United States. This suggests, there's some considerable pathology at work here. This is a very wealthy country. It spends more on its military every year than the next 10 countries combined, but there are 38 million people living in poverty. According to the US government statistics, 34 million people are hungry. 500,000 people are homeless. Talking about violence, there are nearly 500,000 sex assaults in the US every year, 1,270 per day. So, talk about carbon footprint, because people did with Qatar. Well, to fly the hundreds of thousands of fans transcontinentally to the United States, but then to fly them thousands of miles within the United States, from a game in New York to a game in LA, or a game in Texas, or a game in Canada, or a game in Mexico. Massive, massive easily going to be the biggest carbon footprint of any World Cup. So obviously, yes, journalists are free to explore these facts and to thread them together in the way that I've just done. But if we're not fired, as in Western media, that's not going to happen. Because in Western media, you don't have the narrative space to question the legitimacy of a Western host of a World Cup. Yet, when it comes to an Arab Muslim host of a World Cup, open season, we can go, the BBC is signaling its audience, this is not your typical World Cup. And they're not doing that to say, hey, we're going back to the part of the world that gave us personal hygiene, the part of the world that gave us mathematics, the part of the world that gave us Greek philosophy because it had to be retranslated. No. This is a view of a colonial mindset of how dare they assume that they can host this premier tournament of global cultural exchange. So that frames also, there's an aversion to the mirror. There's a aversion to the sense of we're actually all connected in a global system. So we'll talk about labor, and migrant labor conditions, absolutely. We should all, as decent human beings that we aspire to be concerned about the conditions in which migrant laborers anywhere in the world work, and we should strive for better and press whichever authorities are able to do that to do better by migrants. We should also perhaps think about why people are migrating. Why is it that hundreds of thousands of workers choose to leave Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, parts of India, Sri Lanka, to come to the Gulf, as migrant laborers? What is it about the global economic order that creates a situation where that's your best choice, to leave your family behind and migrate? Could it have something to do with debt regimes that are imposed by international financial institutions to preserve the interests of banks ahead of the poor people of those countries? Could it have something to do with the inflation? Even the Ukraine war has imposed a cost on the poor of the global South in terms of bread prices, fuel prices, etc. So if we're talking about migrant labor, we're talking about a comprehensive global system created originally, as we know, in the era of British colonialism. But putting that aside, there's a real story. Similarly, we can talk about the question of how do you get FIFA to award you the World Cup? Is it because you present the best presentation, your interactive, what's the word? I can't remember. PowerPoint game is good? No. This is not, the idea that it's suggested that there might have been some unethical practices in Qatar winning the World Cup. I haven't investigated this specifically. It wouldn't shock any football historian who knows that basically every World Cup since at least 1998 in France has involved something similar. This is the FIFA system. It wasn't created by Qatar, but if you followed the coverage ahead of the World Cup, you would imagine that, this is something new and distinct and unique to this sort of Muslim country interloper, stepping into, this established order. So the tropes certainly read as Islamophobic or read as colonial. This idea, and perhaps this is. It's challenging unspoken assumptions in Western societies about their prerogatives, about tutelage, about the rest of the world will need to become more like us, and we need to follow our paths. And hang on a second. Here are the ungoverned, the untamed, acting confidently on their own terms, imposing their own terms on their own event, like no beer, big crisis. The ability to set terms and priorities that the Western powers and conversations have always assumed is suddenly being challenged, under threat. A World Cup without beer, turns out, guess what? The World Cup, there was no beer because Qatar had the ability to basically cancel to pay the check that meant you didn't need the Budweiser sponsorship, and the World Cup was great. Even the Western media organizations, yes, this was actually a great environment. People were very safe and comfortable, different to Europe. Anyone who's been to football games in Europe knows that it's thrilling, but sometimes a little scary. Okay, quick couple of points. The one thing that sort of struck me as well is, this kind of coverage summons up tropes, right? Summons up, and sometimes very actively. Like when you're you're representing Qatar football players as, bearded militants carrying assault rifles. You're trying to tell people, hey, this is what's happening here. I mean, obviously, the one thing has nothing to do with the other. You're trying to persuade people to imagine this event in a frame of fear. And it does sort of strike me that if you watch and I really think research would be really interesting to audit the pattern of coverage, like how we go through from a sort of dribble of coverage, asking, sometimes legitimate questions, definitely framing a narrative, to suddenly this torrent that a lot of us were really shocked at the wave of hysteria. And I think that is cultivated by certain sort of echo chamber effects. And I think I've seen pieces in The Intercept and other places over the years that sort of point out that there was a very conscious effort, expensive effort by some countries that, or powers that had, didn't want to see Qatar succeed. Think the Intercept has bluntly talked about UAE funding PR companies, etc., to sort of encourage the story. It would be interesting to sort of map the journalistic culture of how the echo chamber thing works to create what became kind of a wave of hysteria. Just a couple of points on, did it succeed, essentially, because that's one of the questions that we're being asked, the legacy. And I'd say yes and no. The wave of hysteria was shocking, but it was largely confined to the West and to Western media. You saw very little resonance in the global South, in the media of the global South, with the sort of narratives that were being had become, common sense in Western media. I think when people think back on the World Cup, what's the legacy? It'll be remembered as one of the greatest World Cups ever. As a football fan, I can say that without reservation. World Cup football games are usually very, very boring. They're usually 1-0 affairs, very cagey. This was open, attractive football, and it's happening in a place that's framed with Muslim in a Muslim country via its norms, etc. People on the negative expectations that were triggered to get the fight-flight response in the West. 1.5 billion people watched the final game in real time. They shared this moment, You can't erase that, you can't reverse that. So I'd say the delegitimization failed. Maybe in some ways that delegitimization was the mourning of a passing of a sort of an assumption of hegemony, of like our values and priorities are going to be everybody's. I feel like I've gone on a little long. I would like to talk about the Palestine significance, but maybe I'll save that for the class.
I'll ask you a question about it.
Yeah, sorry.
So let's see whether the BBC shows a documentary on gun violence in the US during the 2026 opening ceremony.
You can take a little bit.
Thank you very much, Tony. And last but not least, Ross.
Hi, everyone. I'm a little in awe now sitting beside the three people here in terms of experience, and Shireen particularly, who I've been retweeting ad nauseum for the last 2 or 3 years. I'm not coming to you today, I suppose, as much an expert in Islamophobia, but more so somebody who has been obsessing over World Cup football for the past 30 years. I was lucky enough that my childhood coincided with the great Jack Charlton team, Ireland 1990, Euro 88. And ever since then, I've been obsessed with World Cup football. And it instilled in me a fascination, as I was bordering on obsession, for the World Cup and everything that's surrounded it since then. And as the tournament has moved from continent to continent, I don't recall in any capacity a discourse that surrounded Qatar 22 in any tournament that happened before it. Now, what I'm referring to here specifically are the number of long-form pieces, newspaper articles, book chapters, even books themselves that appeared in the years before the event describing not the possibilities of the tournament, as was customary, but the country that was to host it. It appeared to be the articles focusing on the customs, practices, laws, and general makeup of Qatari society completely overshadowed the number of articles attempting to analyse the tournament in sporting terms. Now, I realise that Qatar is the first Arab country to host a World Cup prompted some of this curiosity, and as also you had this very long run-up period announced as a host in 2010, the tournament that happened for 12 years. Speaking to journalists during the World Cup last year, there was always a kind of a quid pro quo in terms of the questions that they were asking me. I asked a few back. And you were challenging these people as to what prompted a lot of the negative coverage. And a few said, oh, this long run-up, 12 years. And you replied to that. You say, well, yeah, but there was 2 other World Cups in between. But it always seemed that Qatar was the one that lurked in the background. A second response was, well, I'd never been to an Arab country before. And he goes, well, okay, but I'd never been to an African country before prior to 2010. It had never been to an Asian country before in East Asia prior to 2002. But you didn't have this same swell of coverage that seemed to immerse Qatar's tournament. And the descriptions of Qatar, as we will all know at this point, was a Muslim state. They were frequently negative, a word used by Craig, one-dimensional, and they were almost nearly always completely ignorant of the history, demography, and culture of Qatari society. They were laden down with stereotypes, dehumanizing stereotypes that was long accepted as the norm in civil societies in Western Europe and North America. Stereotypes that first emerged generations ago when colonial actors from primarily Britain and France left their home nations and translated any cultural difference they met in this region with other peoples as a mark of, paradoxically, both inferiority and threat. Now, at this point I should probably remind people, because I know Danyel mentioned it earlier, that I teach post-colonial literature in Qatar University. And while sports studies has dominated what I've done in terms of research over the past 5 or 6 years, every now and then I kind of revert back to a literature project. And the last of these was an article on Qatari author Abdelaziz Al-Mahmoud for the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing, and a piece that required reading some of the many, many memoirs and travel writings of European adventurers who came to explore the Gulf in the 1800s. And now many of these works portrayed the region and the people who lived here in the most reductive, primitive, and negative fashion. And in a similar way to, say, something like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, it's highly unlikely that accounts such as these will be published today. But what struck me was, as my attention was often brought back to Qatar 22 by reading various media reports and such, was the bizarre number of similarities that existed between these 19th century accounts and those written about Qatar in the years leading up to the tournament. Now, a good example of the former, and one that's widely available in Qatar National Library and also on digitized copy, so you can access it online, and up in Qatar University there's actually a reprint of a physical copy, is George Sadler's Diary of a Journey Across Arabia, and it's a short memoir first published in 1866 that documented this chap's journey. He was a British naval officer, as I said, from Bahrain via Zubarah onto Saudi Arabia and across that country to the Red Sea. Now, if you compare, I'm going to just paraphrase or loosely describe what he wrote, compare how he describes his time in the region with your own recollections of articles you may have read about Qatar 22. The landscape was hostile, burning sun, barren terrain. The local people he met en route, if and when he did so, very rarely, were a mixture of those who attempted and failed to mimic Western civilization, or those who were untrustworthy, uncaring, but who were very rarely given a voice. It was a place, and this is a direct quote, of superstition and fanaticism. It was paralyzed by tradition, riven with inequality, and in short, the region was a cultural dead zone. Nothing existed here until he and people like him came. Now, as I wandered down this little rabbit hole, it occurred to me that many of the journalists and authors who wrote about Qatar for that World Cup, they weren't massively dissimilar in terms of these explorers. And during that tournament, Abdullah, Danyel, I know we all spoke to many of these people, and I apologize to journalists who are out there listening to me describe them as such. But we asked them, well, I asked them personally about their experiences of Qatar and the experiences of their colleagues who were writing authoritatively about this country and the tournament that it was hosting. The vast majority had never been here before. And these were prominent Western publications from the United States and from Britain. Those who were here were at best here for a week, 2 weeks, some as much as 10 years ago. None spoke the language bar one, an Italian journalist. None knew the history, culture of Qatari society, particularly the culture of history and sport in this country, which was something that was very bizarre because this is what they were here to write about. Their work was presented, though, in the same manner as travel writings and memoirs of the 19th century. It was empirical fact. It was something that you couldn't reproach, and if you did, I think the moderator of the previous session, when he asked who polices these things, you were dismissed as just presenting another case of whataboutism. You were going against this dominant narrative that had been created by certain journalists and publications located primarily in Britain and North America. With these parallels in mind and the unparalleled, sorry about the repetition there, amount of negative coverage unlike that given to any previous tournament host over the past 30 years, I think it's fair to say that there is a degree of skepticism that must be brought to bear on many of these descriptions of Qatar as a World Cup host. Now, Daniel asked us a second question. I don't mean to be jumping ahead here, but he also asked us to what extent was the accusation of Islamophobia used to delegitimize valid concerns, and concerns such as the treatment of migrant workers, women's rights, etc., in Qatar. And this, I think, is a very, very valid question to ask. It's important to reflect upon. Are the cries of Islamophobia just a convenient foil to allow the continuation of certain bad practices in Qatari society, brought to the world's attention by the World Cup, to continue? But I do think there's some merit in those arguments that say much of the negative portrayals of Qatar 22 were born out of Islamophobia. But I think the important thing to note is that this can't be the only response to such criticisms. If all criticisms of Qatar 22 are read as examples of Islamophobia, it just creates this us versus them binary that obscures many of the positive changes that Qatar made in the lead up to the World Cup. And rather than lapsing into the latter, the narrative should be more about promoting and advancing these positive changes. And this speaks to stuff that Craig was saying earlier on, that if you're not writing your own narrative, well, someone else is going to do so. And these include the overhaul of the kafala system. And I think it was Shireen who mentioned, I can give you statistics on this teaching in Qatar University. The number of university graduates we have in terms of male to female graduates is 3 to 1. So it's huge. The lawmakers, the policy makers, the identity makers of Qatar in the next generation are going to be predominantly female. But these things are rarely included in any discussion of Qatar. And when they are included, they're often dismissed as whataboutism. You point to some tragic case of a Nepalese chap who may have been killed in an unfortunate accident, and this is taken as the dominant narrative. And I think the last thing, this is where I'm going to dwell upon, is we have to consider the importance of the dynamics of play here, that what prompts these responses of that criticism is Islamophobic. The frequent dismissal of these responses, which cite fact, which cite real-world occurrences, when you dismiss these as whataboutism, this creates a frustration, I feel. The second of these is this impossibly utopian standard that Qatar was held to as a World Cup host, standards that no other host has had to follow. We have to ask, was this because Qatar is an Islamic country? And the acid test to such a claim will be more clear in the media with the next World Cup. When you have a number of accusations that faced by Qatar, they'll re-emerge in the main host country. And Tony has touched on a few of these when he talks about the gun violence that has come to define America over the past 10 years. But there are striking parallels here that we can just identify. Shireen pointed out America is a country where certain games will be played in 3 states where temperatures are going to be like a summer's day in Doha. But what mention is that there in the media? Those 3 states there are also states where women have no agency over their own bodies. It's a tournament that was going to force tournaments to travel thousands of miles back and forth across a continent throughout the 4-week event. And most importantly, it's a country that's going to prevent many of the fans who attended Qatar 22 from attending primarily due to their faith or nationality. Something intrinsically a part of them is going to prevent them from joining this tournament. If the same levels of criticism are not directed towards the next World Cup host, and you hope that there will be in the sense of fairness, one can only surmise that rather than delegitimizing valid concerns about aspects of Qatari society, that such aspects, accusations of Islamophobia around Qatar 22 are somewhat grounded in truth. And that's pretty much it now, guys.
Daniel, I just was wondering, I forgot to answer the second question, and if I could just scaffold really quickly off what Thomas was saying, is that all right? Just really quickly. The question that I was asked similarly is how were accusations of Islamophobia used to delegitimize concerns as treatment of migrant workers and women's rights? And as opposed to what you're saying about a binary created, my take is that 2 things can exist at the same time. Qatar can have questionable practices and policies, but also be exposed to and have actually be forced and what am I trying to say? Subject to constant and intense scrutiny that is marinated in anti-Muslim sentiment. So those two things can actually exist at the same time. And you know, it's not an attempt to deflect from valid criticisms of migrant workers, and we may disagree on the numbers, but the reporting was, you know, there was reporters asked to leave Qatar in their attempts to investigate these very stories. And there's one thing that Western journalism clings to is their ability of free speech and be able to report this. So not being able to do that wasn't great. And you know, another example of that was, just Tony mentioned it, was very much the testimonies of women who attended this World Cup. The lack of alcohol in those spaces rendered it a far safer event. I've been to 4 World Cups, and this by far, as a visibly Muslim woman, was the best one for me to attend. There was no fear, there's no hooliganism in the same way. And I think that's an important element, that's something that may not be understood fully. And the last thing, I'll just really quickly, there was something that topped it off for me was the incident when Messi was honored with a bisht at the very end. And Western media completely freaked out about how that moment was stolen without understanding that giving him that bisht was actually an honor. And they didn't understand that, which goes to show if they had Googled or gone on TikTok for 5 seconds, they would have understood what that meant. And subsequently, so many people from the United States and Europe tried to flock to the souk to find a bisht to wear home after Messi wore one, and Argentine supporters. So that was a very interesting juxtaposition as well.
Nobody bothered the sombrero for Pelé at the Mexico World Cup. So we have a number of questions, and please continue submitting. Maybe everybody can have a bit like shorter answers and the introductory round. And the first one is for Craig. If government-controlled media hides issues and gives a sense of stability, why would the government change that?
That's a great question. Why would you? Because there's advantage in doing that. My argument, again, if you don't like the stereotypes that are told about you, tell your own story. Many countries restrict free press on the theory, and that includes my country, that it lends to political stability. A free press comes with all kinds of risks, and journalism everywhere is blamed for the shortcomings of governance. So yeah, there's a risk to doing that. But again, Qatar is pledged to this in the past. I can't imagine why you would bring an American journalism school here if you didn't have in mind liberalizing your media laws. And again, there's a lot of ways to do that, right? And the current law is so antiquated that there's lots of room for change.
Yeah. And the National Vision states that Qatar wants to become an advanced country by 2030. So
well, if you look at the big pillars of Qatar's 2030 program, they're all basically free expression. There's sports, higher education, art, and I'm missing one. But the point is they're all, you know, sport is infused with human rights and expressive issues. Sport itself is, you know, very expressive. So again, I would just say Qatar's commitment here hasn't been met yet by legal reform.
Yeah.
In fact, it's been undone. I mean, the scourge of media law everywhere for the past 10 years has been cybercrime laws and false news laws. And cybercrime is a real thing, but cybercrime laws generally tend to be, you know, criminalize sedition, criticism of the government. And then false news laws, there's tons of false news out there, do much the same thing. And you know, I do representation for the International Senior Lawyers Project, and I represented clients in the last 3 years in Algeria, Palestine, and Iraq, all charged under cybercrime laws. And in every case, what we argue is that you are in violation of the commitment you made when you ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 19. And so far, we won acquittals in all those cases. But yeah, free speech comes with a lot of risk. And again, I wouldn't recommend the American system to anyone. I wouldn't recommend the British system to anyone. There's ways to think about this, but it's hard to even have the discussion here.
Yeah. So those questions which are not addressed to a specific panelist, I take the liberty to address to give it to a specific person. Shireen, maybe you can answer the next question from Yasmina Benani. As a Morgan, I'd like to inquire about the impact of our national team's success in the World Cup. And I would like to add that not just the men's team was quite successful at the men's World Cup, also the women's team qualified for the first time for a World Cup and even made it to the knockout stage. And I'm saying this as a German who was in the same group. Has it contributed to countering Islamophobia?
I mean, and just to clarify, the country was Morocco where they're from?
Yes.
Yeah. I think there's an understanding since Mohammed Salah went to Liverpool, he's eradicated Islamophobia in that space. That's not actually true. That's not what happens. I think the discussions broaden, and that's where we're going to start. The discussions and the interrogations of the subjects begin to be more mainstream. Never have I seen Muslim sportswomen even a choice to discuss their clothing, which is still a barrier in football. As I mentioned, and I cannot overstate this, France does not permit women who choose to wear hijab to officiate, to play, to be involved with a team at any capacity. That is in violation of a player's right to access sport in the sake of very sacred, laïcité. And I say that as a pun, yes. But I think the thing here is with Morocco, we saw a joy brought from a culture of North African football, and people that are tuned in, and arguably the Premier League for men and now the Super League for women that are based in England are considered the best and most elite leagues in the world. Whereas if you watch African football, and I know Tony you'll agree with me, the level of football in AFCON is absolutely exhilarating, because the beauty about this game is that it encompasses cultures from all over the world. And if you go somewhere and you play football, you don't actually have to speak the language if that's what you do. It involves 22 people, a ball, you don't even wear footwear, and you can use bottles or bags as your goalposts. So it's like really phenomenal and then sociologists and cultural anthropologists have definitely done studies about this and the effects of that. Now in terms of Morocco, we saw joy, we saw excitement, and I will tell you the most exuberant fans I've seen, and a little bit unaware of personal space, have been Moroccan fans. Like I had this man jump into my lap practically, and I was like, no, that's not happening. But at the same time, there was an electricity in the air, but also so brilliantly infused with many other things. I've never seen so many, Kufay or Palestini calls for that type of liberation and anti-oppression ever in my life, and I've attended so many sporting events. So that was kind of culture shock, and bringing that element was something that was largely ignored by Western press purposefully. Like you couldn't get a shot. I was speaking to a cameraman from an American network, and he was saying, I've been told to avoid Palestinian flags when I pan. So Morocco and the players came out with flags. So it was very difficult to weed through and avoid it. And that's something that Morocco did so beautifully, but also, and I did reporting on this about Morocco, their commitment to women's football, in addition to the men's, is unparalleled in the world. They have 2 tiers of professional women's league that are paid. The United States doesn't do that. Don't even get me started on Canada. We don't even have a domestic professional league for football yet. So Morocco is, in their plan, they also have a strategic plan, is way ahead, and it's going to leave people in the dark, and this is something Europe and Canada and the United States can't even hold their own World Cup. They have to do it together. They don't have the money, they're decrepit in terms of their infrastructure. Investment in women's football in particular will come from this region, and people need to deal with that. And it may be very ungraceful the way it's dealt with, but I've been saying this for a long time. There has been work on the ground, and Moroccan women, Saudi women, Qatari women, women in the Emirates have been doing the work and grassroots levels for a very long time, and that also gets ignored in the discussion.
Yeah, that's true, and particularly now in the discussion on the Saudi national women's football team is ranked since March on the FIFA rankings. That's something that's not much reported. And since you mentioned Mo Salah, there is a Georgetown graduate, Salma Musa, who's now a professor at Yale University, and she did a study where she and colleagues argued that hate crime and online incites in the greater Liverpool area decreased since Salah is playing there. The next question, Tony, I think would also give you the opportunity to talk about Palestine. And how did Western media's portrayal of Qatar as a World Cup host intersect with broader narratives about Islam and the Middle East?
I feel like I'm taking advantage of the question to talk about Palestine, but I think that it's not insignificant. Also, I wanted to add something on Morocco, if you would, very briefly. One thing that fascinated me about that Morocco game, well, the Morocco performance, but also the Morocco-France game actually epitomizes something where you're seeing the post-national emerge. That essentially you're seeing Morocco play France, and what you're seeing is two groups of players who come from Europe's underclasses. They're all players who live in Europe. They're all players who live in the banlieue of Paris, in Germany, Holland, Spain. And you saw the connection, the solidarity between the players, because they actually all, in some ways, they share an experience. And in some ways, this is, football can be a leading indicator. We are entering a less and less nationally framed, a world in which borders, belonging, citizenship are questions that we need to explore a lot more critically, and I think the World Cup actually helped us in that. I think in terms of the narrative, Western media narrative is like, what are the priorities here? Well, the general priority of Western media right now would be, at the time of the World Cup, Ukraine. Okay, Ukraine is the top priority of everyone. And then, when it comes to discussing the Arab world, well, it's like, how do we liberalize it? How do we make it more like us? We're going to explore LGBTQ rights issues. The European countries, maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, adopted these changes, and now we expect you to comply and to address the issues in the same way as they're addressed in European countries, regardless of whether that is in fact consonant with the as you say, people avoiding talking to the local LGBTQ communities even and following their needs. So I think in some ways the Palestine emphasis at the World Cup was also a challenge to the World Cup, to the internet, the global media conversation, because Palestine is not part of the conversation in Western media. It's like, no, we want to talk about Ukraine, not Palestine. We'll ban Russia 2 weeks after it invades Ukraine. Israel's been in violation of FIFA basic statutes for decades, and it's like, no, we'll just make that go away somehow. It's a little awkward and uncomfortable. And I think even if we take the Abraham Accords, Morocco has normalized with Israel. So the fact that its players step up on the field and they're showing Palestinian flags, that's a huge dissent. That is the World Cup presenting the Arab public sphere, Arab civil society with a space to express itself. Don't get me started. Football stadiums are an incredible liberatory space. Regimes cannot control what happens in a football stadium. Ask the Catalans, ask the South Africans. Ambassador Rasool will confirm that we could see the ANC flag being flown in stadiums, which was get you in jail for 7 years. But no cop's going to go into a stadium full of 80,000 people to pull down a flag, because not a good idea. So things can happen in football stadiums and in the civic spaces that football creates that are not the intention of any governments, any powers, and certainly challenge media orthodoxies.
Yeah, thank you. Ross, another question is it evident that sports became more and more politicized? For example, Russia's expel from the major tournaments. In what ways do sports serve as a platform to promote political messages in Islamophobia?
I think a lot of what Tony just said there, that stadiums are a space that have been they're exempt from what can happen on the street, things you normally get arrested for or maybe stopped in saying by a member of the public or police. You are allowed to do these things in football stadiums. So to flip what Tony was saying, I think we saw a very, very latent example of it during the World Cup, and one that was framed as humorous by British journalists particularly was you had a small number of British fans entering grounds dressed as Crusader Knights. And I don't know how they got into Qatar with metal chainmail and armor and all this kind of stuff. But they were going to games, 1 or 2 games, fully adorned as Knights of the Crusade. And they couldn't believe that they were being stopped. This was a part of their identity. This is who they were. There was no harm in it, is what the general thrust of what their message was. And this is what was reinforced by newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Guardian and the Telegraph, who covered this event as like a storm in a teacup. How dare they stop us prioritising who we are? There was no recognition of the fact of what these symbols actually represented. And I think I actually spoke on Al Jazeera Plus about this that it was somewhat akin to somebody going to an American football game, a college game with a Confederate flag. And yeah, and it's deeply insulting and horrifying to some people, but others might say it's a part of my identity. But it doesn't mean it's acceptable. But because these things are taking place in a football ground, it's a space that's exempt. And a lot of people, such as James Dorsey, Maher Mahazi, and a few more, have written about this at length. But that was a real-world example that we saw in Qatar 22 of people, British people, English people, thinking that this was acceptable behavior, which was very unusual in a Muslim country, that you could celebrate an act that resulted in the deaths of tens and thousands of Muslim people.
I think, Craig, the next question is for you. How does the transformation of media into content relate to or influence Islamophobia?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I just don't like the word content. When I first was introduced to it as a journalist, it came from the MBAs who took over our newsrooms. And suddenly journalism and reporting were secondary to, and I get this. I mean, when you talk about press independence, the law is one thing, but the thing that matters most is the revenue system. And in that respect, there's no such thing as independence. There just isn't. You're dependent on your revenue source, and there's really only three possibilities. You either sell something, advertising or subscriptions, you get donations from either individuals or Jeff Bezos, or you have government subsidies, either as tax relief or direct subsidies. Whatever that mix of revenues is, it would not be controversial to any economist to tell you that that has something to do with your editorial mission. So I get the economic side when I work with clients around the world. The number one thing is if you want to, being a good is not a business plan. A business plan is actually figuring out how you're going to make money. And so I'm going to do a story about Taylor Swift before I do a story about, human rights in sports, because that's an easy one. And two, the other one comes with real human costs. I mean, news that's serious has all the qualities of a public good. It has very high real costs and very low marginal costs. And it's just hard to sustain. So it feeds a lot of bad journalism, and bad journalism is everywhere, and there's good money in it everywhere, from here to Chicago. But when you talk about it as content, it frankly, we just went through this in the writer's strike in the United States, where it was all about content. And there's a huge difference in the quality of content. It's not all the same to me. And I think as a journalist, that should matter to you, because there's a lot of crap out there that passes as journalism. And it's, again, to me, the main thing about it is reporting, investigating, bringing to it the skills of investigation, using scholarship to, develop your theses and test them out. I just don't like the word. I'm rather old-fashioned in that regard, I think.
Yeah. So maybe, Ross, the next question would be good for you to answer. Do you think, from Artika, do you think Saudi's so-called buying of football will have any impact on Islamophobic perceptions of the region?
Definitely, yeah. I think it's going to ease them to some degree, because we see it already doing, and I've noticed this, the number of Al Nassr jerseys that are all over the place. And we noticed one, I think we noticed one in Canada during the summer, because you have a certain number 7 on the background. What sport does, and we can use Mo Salah as a fantastic example, even though he hasn't gone to Saudi yet, and it probably will happen, Abdullah, in the next 12 months. But sport breaks down those barriers, and it's using football as a vehicle, football as the most dominant hegemonic sport. And I think this is something you've written about as well, Danyel, in the past, that football shows us difference in a very positive light, and it shows us difference not as an inferiority or as a threat. It shows us as something that we can actually enjoy, something that can be an addition to our society. Obviously, these games will be taking place in Saudi as opposed to Mo Salah playing in Anfield or Old Trafford or somewhere. But when you're seeing players that you worship, and it was an education I got in recent weeks that young people, kids nowadays, they don't follow football teams as much, they follow players. And what Saudi is doing, they're gobbling up players, and those players are a brand unto themselves. So when you have a Benzema, when you have a Ronaldo, what you're doing is you're bringing in a new generation of, I'm going to say, predominantly small, white, Western kids looking at a different culture and looking at it in a much different light to their parents. They're seeing it in terms of hat tricks, amazing feats of skill. they're looking at it in terms of a language of achievement rather than a language of violence or negativity, which is how Saudi has been largely framed in a Western discourse for the past 20 or 30 years.
It would be interesting to compare the media coverage of the North American Soccer League in the US at the end of the 1970s, when Pelé, Beckenbauer, all the greatest player of the game, went to the US, with the coverage now where Saudi is basically doing the same.
I think that would be a test of the longevity. Like that American league that faded in the early 80s. But the difference there with those guys was bringing over the likes of George Best, Beckenbauer, Pelé, who were in their mid to late 30s when they were really at the end of their career. The Saudi blueprint is a little different in that you've got guys with a lot of life left in their legs, and they'll be there for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
Just a thought, two things that's come up a little bit. One of the great things about sports is it allows you to have conversations about really difficult topics, including race, sex, gender. I don't know how many otherwise sober people will tell you that black people are just naturally good at basketball, but they can't swim. Okay, there's an opening, let's have a conversation about this. With respect to Saudi Arabia, I mean, sports is just one of 13 investment areas, and probably the smallest one. It's way smaller than, say, real estate. And it's fairly much focused on a domestic audience. You know, you have a large population, I forgot what it is, that's under the age of 35, giving them something to do. So, and I think they're quite realistic about it. When we talk about sport washing, say what you want about Mohammed bin Salman, but he nails that one. To me, sports is about, especially international competitions like the World Cup and the IOC, are about the unfairness and ugliness of global capitalism.
Exactly.
And corruption is everywhere. You know, the 5th most valuable sport in the world is American collegiate athletics, where they're all amateurs. I'm sure there's nothing amiss there, but you know, Americans celebrate this like nothing's going on.
Would somebody of you would like to add something on Saudi?
Well, from a media perspective, one of the biggest narratives is the sport washing of it. But I think, again, it's really important to distinguish the men's game from the women's. The women who are getting contracts are with a league that was initially a regional league, then a domestic league, and now is growing. And there's very few women that can get contracts for livable wages without having secondary, third jobs in North America, or unless you're a top player. So going to Saudi is a very viable option for some women wanting to play. Just recently, a British player, an English player who plays for Nigeria just signed. Exactly. So I think it's really important to remember that the options, that it's not the same thing for the women's game that is for the men. And just recently there was a picture of Benzema, and he was in full regalia in Saudi, and then the narrative, because people are very angry, first of all, his relationship with France is a whole other panel. And the way that it was like, oh, he sold out for this, and the conversation about Jordan Henderson, who was very, very beloved to Liverpool fans when he left for Saudi. I mean, his media training is very poor and his answers were really bad. But at the end of the day, I think he should have just been like, I went for the money, and called it a day instead of trying to legitimize why he left. He was considered a very strong ally to gay communities and gay groups, and then when he left for Saudi, they're like, well, you sold out on that, which creates another level of issue that you're not recognizing the communities that already exist there. And there's an erasure of that. So there's no nuance at all in any of these conversations, is my bottom line. And it's a lack of understanding of media completely, who have no idea how to report on this, because for so long it's been like, their women are bad. Women have been allowed into Saudi stadiums since 2017. So they're not, and they've always wanted to go. So there's all those issues about that as well. So.
Yeah, Tony, you would like to add something?
I just wanted to add, one thing. I think the Saudi league is going to be a mixed bag. It's probably too soon to tell. I'm not sure. I think it still players mostly in the twilight years, maybe a few more. As a fan, I'm kind of annoyed. I was annoyed when they took Fabinho. They can have Hendo because his decision making is terrible. Fabinho was kind of annoyed. Like, he left a big gap at the back of our midfield. So I'm responding as a fan. But there's not an Islamophobic dimension to that, because Salah is ours. Salah prays every time he scores, etc. I mean, there's almost the Islamophilia that it's also an othering, though you have to consider when Liverpool fans are singing, you know, he scores one for me, scores one for you, scores another few, I'll be Muslim too, i.e. he's exotic. Versus, you know, when it comes in France, they ban players during a game who are fasting from from stopping the game for players to break their fast. In England now, it's actually a norm. It's like nobody comments on it. It's like, you know, Sané is fasting. Sadio Mane is fasting. Yeah, he's breaking his fast, fine. Game goes on. It's just part of the game. But the last element of the Saudi, etc. conversation, again, it's one of those. We'll talk about what's happening out there. Come on, like. Saudi Arabia owns Newcastle, the Emirates own Manchester City, and the Qataris are trying to buy Manchester United. And then never mind their investment in this, you know, the investment fund that owns Chelsea, etc. Come on, like so much of the money at the very center of European football comes from the Gulf. So it's not, you know, it's not, the Saudi League is only one part of that story.
Yeah, Ross?
Could I just go back to the Jordan Henderson example? I think a lot of the nub of the bad reaction, the negative criticism he faced for that, was it forced many English fans to just realize the hypocrisy as that's defined a lot of their interactions with football in the Gulf, whether it be Saudi or Qatar. If they're positioning themselves as a good actor, as Jordan Henderson represented, for him to come up and say, look lads, I just did it for the money, it shows the ugliness and the greed that underpins modern sport as a whole. And I think this hypocrisy is something that the British media has had immense difficulty in embracing or even discussing. The LGBT thing that Henderson was at the forefront during the World Cup. Virgil van Dijk was another person who was speaking towards it. But these guys were speaking, they're both coming from league, the same team, Premier League, but I can speak about Spain, Germany, Italy and France. There's not one out homosexual player in any of those leagues. Exactly. So these guys are speaking from leagues where their own colleagues, their own workmates, their own teammates, call them what you will. None of them are comfortable enough to sit in the same dressing room as Jordan Henderson and say, I am what I am. But at the same time, Jordan Henderson is coming out saying, well, this is how we should be living your lives, whether you live in Britain or you live in Saudi or live in Qatar. And for him to turn around and then just take a very lucrative contract in Saudi Arabia and then just not say what you say, look, guys, I did it for the cash, so my grandkids and their kids will never have to work again. I think that's the nub of the issue there, this hypocrisy that the British media, particularly when it comes to football, it just can't face.
Yes. So the next question is not easy to answer, I guess. Are there any notable differences in how Islamophobia manifests in sports compared to other sectors of society? Craig?
I don't know, but I would say this. When I was first signed up for this, my first thought was I don't know anything on this subject. In American sports, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't find Islamophobia endemic in any of our major sports, and frankly, we don't care about yours. There's nothing like packy bashing that you would find in England comparable in the United States. It occurs more, I think, at an individual level, and it's directed especially at women. Is that fair?
I mean, it's a little bit. I mean, there's racism in very many layers, and
We
then
have
there's
the
like
anti-black racism. That's our
absolutely.
ticket. Yeah.
But then you've got anti-indigeneity in North Americans
Yep.
in hockey, for example, and then you've got like Nazem Kadri, who plays hockey for the Calgary Flames, who's born and raised in Canada, of Lebanese, he's Muslim. He took the Stanley Cup to a mosque, but it's because racists are not actually very nuanced either. And so they'll accuse anyone they won't understand that a Sikh is not a Muslim. So it's like that's a difficult question to answer because as we know, Islamophobia is racism. So it's applied across the board, but it's just because of the diversity within football, you may see it more. But I mean, as someone who is like from West Africa, and who's Muslim will get the same anti-black racism because they're Afro-Arab Muslims, right? They'll get, or they're black Muslims, they'll get that same level of, banana throwing which is horrific in any capacity. But sport is a microcosm and a reflection of society as well. And if it happens in those spaces, it's permeating in society as well.
I think both Tony and Ross would like to add something. Ross, would you go first?
I think just to rephrase the question again, is Islamophobia in sport the same as you see in other aspects of society? I think probably in sport it might even be a little worse, because it's often struck me as strange that when we look at 21st century civil societies in Western Europe and North America, that there is this level of wokeness that makes any kind of racism, it's called out immediately. But the one thing that always seems to get a pass is a racism directed towards Muslims. And this is something that you see casually on Twitter, and I'll refer to Abdullah again, memes that we see that we've sent each other, not out of humor, but more of a kind of, oh my God, have you seen this? And one was about Eddie Howe, the Newcastle manager, when his team was getting beaten 3-0 a couple of weeks ago. You might have seen this. The opposing fans, the Brighton fans, were singing, "You're getting beheaded in the morning." And that was the chant coming from the terraces. A second one by a very reputable bookmaker, as much as a bookmaker can be reputable, was that after the draw was made for the Champions League, the quip was, UEFA officials have contacted Newcastle or Saudi owners to reassure them that the group of death should not be taken literally. And because you're seeing these examples set in a very humorous fashion, this is how it's absorbed and interpreted by people in football terraces, that this is funny, this is not harming anybody, this is not discriminatory. You wouldn't say this about an African team, someone coming from sub-Saharan Africa. You wouldn't say this about a team coming from South Asia or East Asia. But it seems when it's wrapped in this form of an acceptable other that the Arab world and Muslims present, I think that's where it's becoming almost worse in sport to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm. Tony?
I was just going to say, I mean, I can speak about football specifically, that the great British historian Eric Hobsbawm once said, "Nowhere is the imagined community of the nation more real than in the form of 11 named players on a football field." So this idea of nations, identities, communities, they're imagined, right? We construct stories, we construct symbols, etc. So in many ways, football is a tableau. It's a space where symbolically we are expressing what we are, or what we think we are, or who we think we are. So I think in some ways it has an exaggerated power, whether for good or negative. It can have an exaggerated influence in countering Islamophobia, but it can also be an amplification of Islamophobic ideas, which don't translate as easily into other social elements, like formal politics. It's like, how often that can happen? There's a football game every weekend. So yeah, I mean, I think for better and worse, football is more volatile as a space of engaging Islamophobia.
So the next question would be also a great discussion question for a class of mine. When it comes to sports, whose responsibility is it to change the narrative? Players, teams, leagues, or countries? Maybe it's unfair when you always have to start, Ross.
Yeah.
I think it's a shared responsibility, but primarily towards the sporting actors themselves. The players by their achievement, which often helps. The media do play a role, and this goes back to, I suppose, a project that I was working on recently, that when you have a constant refrain about Qatar when it got awarded the World Cup was it was a country with no football history, no sporting history. And something I completed recently was just looking at a history of sporting achievement in the Gulf, and then when you go back to it, it's staggering. And nations, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi, they have a palmarès that would be beyond any country in the world in the football sense, bar a small handful located in Western Europe, not including England, who haven't won anything in 50 years. But the only rival nation would be Egypt, perhaps, for the amount of honours that they've won in AFCON. But these things are left out of the narrative completely. So when you're looking at it in terms of media, there has to be a language of achievement about what these nations have done, both in an Olympic context and a sporting context. I do think, and this might be jumping ahead for a few people, FIFA have to play a part in this. They can't just step back and Infantino pretend I am this and I am that when he has no interest really in being anything bar who's paying him next. FIFA have to have an orchestrated role there where they are giving actors from other nations other than the dominant Western nucleus a voice. So it's not just a one-man operation, there's 3 or 4 bodies involved there.
Tony?
So my strong feeling, and again, Palestine's actually a perfect example, sorry to bang on about Palestine, but actually the players and the fans, which are the global civil society of the game, actually have a heavy responsibility precisely because the institutions, i.e. FIFA, the local FA, governments, are captured, and very easily captured, and very easily swayed. So if you look at the efforts via the top-down strategy of getting Israel held accountable at FIFA, why do they fail? They fail because they're in the hands of FIFA in general, the governments that influence FIFA, even the Palestinian FA, which is captive to the Palestinian Authority and makes political we'll leave that aside, so you'll give us something else. So, whereas you look what happened at the World Cup in Qatar, players and fans who are the chemistry, they're the essence of the game, and they have much more power than they know, than they realize. Because there's no comeback, there's no backlash from players showing the Palestinian flag, whether it's in Qatar at the World Cup or whether it's Paul Pogba at the end of a game for Manchester United flying the Palestinian flag. That's incredibly powerful. And you really have, in the same way as we say, players have an obligation, say when one of their teammates is being racially abused, you're not leaving it to the authorities and to that player or other black players to respond. It's the responsibility of all the players to respond. So you really want to cultivate citizenship among players and fans.
Shireen?
Yeah, I think that the responsibility of any type of combating any type of oppression shouldn't fall on the ones being exposed to that, being attacked, and that's something I feel very strongly about in terms of racial injustice or any. I think allyship is not something that can be granted. It's something it's a verb. You should be, and I prefer the word co-conspirator actually, but. I think that's really important, and if I'm looking to destabilize systems of oppression, I'm not going to look at the ones being oppressed first and foremost. We're the ones with the most voice. I see this repeatedly with racialized players, Muslim or not, in North America. How do you feel about racist abuse? Why don't you ask their white teammate? Why don't you ask the captain? Why don't you ask the owner of the team or the president of the team? And one of my mentors in this space is Dave Zirin, and he's a sports editor for The Nation. And it's from him I learned to just sort of, even the questions and the way that they're being asked, the questions are fine. They're being directed to the wrong person. So while I do agree with Ross that it is the responsibility of everybody, but it seems like, and it's not just FIFA, UEFA is completely complicit in this also, and goes very often, and these governing bodies go without accountability because of the highest level of policy making that there is. And they need to be held to account. They need to be asked questions. They need that, and I think it's so many people. It's supporters, it's fans. If you see even that and any type of oppression, if you hear homophobia or racism or misogyny at your table in your discussions, fix it. I think that my responsibility, I have 4 children, 3 sons, and a soccer player. My daughter is the soccer player. And it is my responsibility to have them unlearn that absolute misogyny that's ingrained in society from a religious level, from really a faith perspective, and also a sports social level. It's very important because, it's so much that we burden people more with that labor. And we should be looking at what can we do for other groups that are more marginalized. And there's not enough of that in sport. How is one person who gets a banana thrown at him supposed to undo years and years of systemic racism? It's ridiculous. It should happen at every single level.
Yeah. Correct.
I'll just say I think journalists do have a responsibility here, kind of picking up on the discussion in the last panel. When I was young, as in the newsroom, we referred to the sports department as the toy department. It's not serious, and the people there didn't keep the same ethical standards the rest of us had to. I think that is changing. You can actually find some excellent sports journalism out there in a number of places. But also, there's a transition going on, and we're even ahead of it here, where sports has long been a Western thing. When sports scholarship came to the academy about 40 years ago, and the first journals were established, I think Ross will back me up on this, overwhelmingly the scholarship focused on North America and Western Europe. And if you look even today at the 20 most valuable sports properties in the world, except for Brazil Serie A and the Indian Premier League, all of them are from North America. and Western Europe. So there's a transition going on, and the Gulf is the center of it, again, because these sports mega events are going to continue to come here because the value, I mean, these are incredibly expensive. And of course, the other thing that's changed is nobody, again, any longer, I don't think, looks at FIFA or the IOC as presumptively virtuous. They're just not. And there's been that reporting, but I think it's picking up. So I'm going to say journalists have a role here.
So we have like approximately 10 more minutes, and I would like to ask the last question, but if there's something that you feel you haven't said yet, then please incorporate this into your answer. I think this is a great last question. To your knowledge, have there been any noticeable shifts in perceptions or attitudes towards Islam and Muslims in the sports community post-World Cup? Ross, would you like to start?
I think there has a little bit. If we could focus directly on the World Cup, Morocco's achievements have helped Saudi beating Argentina was another kind of bright flare in the sky that made a lot of people sit up and take attention. Focusing specifically on the World Cup, I think what made the biggest difference was the influx of fans that came in who saw with their own eyes a place that was completely at odds with what they had been expecting. And again, this speaks to my own experiences of the tournament where I went to multiple games and you acted as this weird kind of vox pop person who started a conversation in queues and things like that, or the people sitting beside you asking, where are you from, how many games have you been to, and what are your impressions of Qatar? And people were, by and large, surprised. They didn't expect a lot of what they felt were freedoms that they had in Qatar to do whatever they pleased. Some anticipated this weird kind of police state where they'd be followed, doors being knocked upon, people being watched at all odds. But they couldn't get over how convivial the atmosphere was, but they couldn't get over how well structured the atmosphere was. And I think this is something that we don't touch upon, in that you had this description or this anticipation that Qatar 22 would fall flat in its face as a tournament, that there was no way you could host that many teams in one small city like this, that there would be no way you would have massive queues going into stadiums, there would be bedlam outside, anarchy inside. It was one of the best run tournaments I've been to. It was the only World Cup I've been to, but in terms of other large-scale sporting events, some of those were chaos. And I think we saw that again before the Liverpool Champions League final in Paris, where you had like an anarchy outside. Qatar 22 demonstrated that you could host a mega event in a Gulf nation, in an Arab nation, in a Muslim nation. Not saying that they're all the same three things, but and you could do it comparably to anything that you'd get in North America or Western Europe. I think that was one of the big things that changed it. People brought this perspective home. They brought this standard home where they're looking at their own home countries now going, why can't our public transport be free during the tournament? It showed an appetite and ability to host these tournaments, as well as an ability, a desire to foot the cost, which is turning off a lot of Western nations nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Tony?
I think I've sort of said most of it before, I'll be brief, but I think normalization, as in a good way, that I think put France aside, and actually putting France aside is a very good idea, and I'm being serious. France's aggressive Islamophobia that has continued and even escalated since the World Cup, I might be wrong, but it feels a little bit like France is a bit of an outlier. With the hijab ban, the ban on fasting players, etc. France is isolating itself, and we should accelerate that, because this is an outlier, and there should be a global civil society conversation about, hang on a second, like you guys are living in, your colonial past is still inscribing everything that you do. But so putting that aside, campaign marching orders, I think there's a real normalization among English fans and the English media culture, one that I'm most familiar with, that a World Cup in an Arab or Muslim country is normal now. It's like, yeah, the Qatar World Cup, what are people going to remember? They're going to remember a series of games. They're going to remember a positive experience. And it's going to become unremarkable. And that's really where you want to get to, that it's unremarkable. So yeah, I would say, you know, it's an ongoing struggle, always will be. But I think in the conversation that those who were attacking Qatar before the World Cup were trying to escalate has abated. And that's a healthy thing.
It's a good point to label France as an outlier. I mean, they can make the rules. They host next year's Olympics, but they cannot make. They can make the rules for their own athletes, but not for the other 200-something countries that will participate. Yeah, Shireen.
I think that one of the ways, and I don't want to present Morocco as a utopia, because I don't think that's right either. Even the discussions within their own communities, and I was reading and learning, was that very much marginalized communities of indigenous Moroccans would disagree. And I think it's fair that we shouldn't look at anything. But in saying that, Morocco has provided us also with an example of a Muslim majority country that has different identities within it. And that's really important. Like if you look at the women's team, for example, or the mothers of the men's players, some wear hijab, some wear abaya, some don't. Some are Christian, some are Muslim. And that's really important in a conversation. And furthermore, hyphenated identities of foreign-born players. Rosella Ayan plays for Tottenham, and she represents Morocco. And then you have others that are born and raised in Morocco and play in Morocco, but others that play around the world but have a very deep connection. And I think that's really important too, as part of the conversation, that even within the Muslim majority spaces, what do non-Muslims and how do they exist in football ecosystem within those places? And I think that's very interesting, and I've been keeping my eye on that for a little while. And like what's growing there and how they're doing it. And hopefully they'll host an iteration, Morocco will, because I have no excitement about 2026 and having to go from Toronto to San Francisco to Guadalajara. And you know, I will say this, from a very selfish perspective, being in Qatar was so easy to cover World Cup, in so much that you could attend so many different matches. I just returned from Australia, and getting from Sydney to Perth is not easy. It's literally a massive continent. So, you know, from a selfish perspective as a practicing journalist, your smaller place is actually really quite nice. And then what happened was you had journalists who were here have an opportunity to look around and have conversations. And that's something else I noticed about this. And I would say actually for a lot of people, coming to Doha was transformative in some ways. It was no longer, you know, this is what I think, and you know, people would say, you know, they would just have, I mean, I have thoughts about people putting on thobes all the time. I mean, not every problem can be solved with like a thobe that is in the flag of Brazil. Like, it's just bizarre to me. But also just sort of this expression of different cultures being expressed here was very important. The Colombian teams, the Ecuadorian teams, and how they danced and celebrated, like that was quite nice. And I hope for more of that, because we definitely need more joy in these spaces, because it's sometimes not the happiest place to work. And I do actually really believe that football is a vehicle for those conversations and a connector of people. Otherwise, I just would have opened a cat cafe and left this a long time ago.
Perfect. Craig?
I don't think I have an answer to your question. To me, as you pose it, it's a research question. I haven't done it. I'm eager to read it. Get busy.
So, we will have now a lunch break until 2 p.m. and then we continue with panel 6, Islamophobia and the Global War on Terror, moderated by my colleague Nadia Sabaiti. And thank you very, very much to all our panelists. Yeah.